Things haven't been so rosy during the final years of World Championship Wrestling. A string of bad decision making along with appalling television had driven fans away in droves. And for the few fans remaining, they were given months worth of terrible wrestling programming until the company was eventually bought off by Vince McMahon and the WWF for a couple $1 million, thus bringing a somewhat shameful closure to a wrestling organization that had planted the seeds of the mid-1990s wrestling boom that would dominate the latter half of that decade, only to fumble its good fortune near the very end. It's almost fitting then that the final ever WCW branded video game be as much of a mess as the organization's final year in service. And make no mistake, despite the unique direction undertaken by today's subject matter, WCW Backstage Assault is nowhere near the above average set piece its most ardent defenders claim it to be. If anything, it is a mere attempt at a bold new direction designed to hide the fact that the actual wrestling game contained within is complete and utter garbage. Some could go as far as to say that it is an embarrassment to the genre. Let's back up a bit. WCW Backstage Assault was the second of two WCW video games conceived by Electronic Arts, essentially a follow-up to their 1999 effort WCW Mayhem. Mayhem, while not exactly a great wrestling game, was still a rather serviceable, almost decent offering, and at the very least was a step in the right direction. While it would be foolhardy to compare it to the N64 offerings of games like World Tour or WCW NWO Revenge, it was at the very least a massive step above the PSX offerings of Nitro and Thunder. If you can overlook some of its flaws, quite a bit of fun can be had with what can be considered a somewhat decent wrestling game. WCW Backstage Assault, on the other hand, has no such redeeming qualities. Not even the rare opportunity to beat up on Vince Russo for his moronic booking decisions over the years can make up for the absolute wretchedness that is... well, take your pick. You know it's a bad sign when the game gives you dozens of pages worth of characters to choose from, and a good chunk of those characters are locked. It'll take you a good while to find a wrestler that's accessible from the start, much less one you'd likely care about in any way, shape, or form. More on that later. As the title suggests, WCW Backstage Assault forgoes the whole wrestling match in a wrestling ring setup that's been done in virtually every single wrestling game ever made, and takes the action exclusively in various backstage areas of some generic nameless arena. Of course, the kicker here is that while the focus is entirely on backstage assaults, no pun intended, your main objective remains to beat your opponent via pinfall, submission, or even knockout. You know, just like what you would do in a wrestling match taking place in a wrestling ring. Wow, you could have fooled me, kids. See, this is a thing that I find somewhat stupid. Making it a game about strictly backstage brawls, which, like it or not, is a part of the whole sports entertainment genre, I don't have a real problem with. But why would you impose wrestling mechanics into it when a concept like this would have been more suited to something akin to a brawler or a fighting game or something a little more straightforward? Why bother going for pinfalls in a backstage brawl? Why bother going for submissions? Backstage brawls aren't two guys wrestling like they do in a ring. They're brawls. They beat the shit out of each other like they do in any movie fight. It's only a wrestling match if it starts in a wrestling ring, and then it spills backstage where they beat each other up with cotton candy or popcorn bags or whatever. But Backstage Assault doesn't do that. It just gives us these backstage brawls with wrestling rules in effect. Man, could you come up with anything dumber? There are three main game modes in Backstage Assault. You have your usual exhibition mode, which is your single one-shot match. The hardcore challenge, which is essentially your usual championship mode, beat everybody to win the title, and you get to pick a level of difficulty represented by one of the three singles titles used in WCW at the time, and a gauntlet mode where you battle opponents continuously or something to that extent, much like a survival mode in any fighting game. Whatever the case may be, it really doesn't matter because it's pretty much the same match type, with the option to make it a first blood match, as if that means anything, because the blood looks like crap. And because there's no wrestling ring to speak of, you just sort of navigate through the arena, through the doors and stuff like that. But because there's no wrestling ring, there's no specialty matches, such as cage matches, ladder matches, or even inferno matches. Hell, there isn't even a tag team option, which is generally a mainstay feature in then modern wrestling games. It's always going to be a one-on-one contest. It's eventually going to get boring. Unfortunately, being boring is the least of this game's woes. As previously mentioned, the character select screen is not very intuitive, as you basically have to flip through several pages just to find a wrestler you might want to use. On top of that, when you first start the game, the majority of the roster is locked and can be unlocked naturally by completing certain objectives within the challenge modes. This in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's perfectly normal for games of this ilk for you to do such things. However, the slots of these locked characters are all over the place, and it ends up being a chore trying to find somebody who is openly accessible. I don't mind scrolling through a list of names to pick a wrestler. The SmackDown games on the PlayStation consoles have had that set up for several iterations, but it wasn't a pain in the ass to look for a specific wrestler in those games that it is here, especially locked characters who are usually bundled together at the end of a list. Add to that all the constant barrage of load times for even the most meager of executions, and I end up just picking the first available wrestler I spot, just to get this crap over with. I mean, what does it matter? All these characters pretty much play the same way anyway, with minor variations in their moves list and finishers. Control in Backstage Assault is pretty abysmal. It's pretty much the same straightforward control scheme that you got in Mayhem, a single grapple button, 3 strike buttons, block button, run buttons, that sort of thing. And Control in Mayhem wasn't actually that bad. It wasn't the greatest thing ever, but it was workable and made the game playable and even enjoyable, and it was a godsend following the tripe that was WCW Nitro and Thunder. With Backstage Assault, you had that same button mapping, and when it works the way it's supposed to, it works well enough. Moves are sometimes quick to respond, but then there are moments where your wrestler would momentarily freeze, and you could mash as many buttons and as many times as you would like, and nothing would happen for that brief instance where your wrestler would just freeze in place, as if giving you the false sense that the match is over, but really isn't. It's also next to impossible to properly Irish whip someone in the direction you want. More often than not, when you press down on the D-pad to aim your whip, you'll end up whipping in the opposite direction. It's pretty pathetic. The other piece of contention is that your grapple button also serves as the button where you climb up objects as well as the button where you pick up weapons. There will be moments where you would want to grapple with your opponent but accidentally pick up a pipe or a piece of machinery instead. Sometimes it'll even be the other way around. On the other hand, maybe you're just better off whacking your opponents with stray objects, of which there are a plentiful amount. After several hits though, the weapons explodes into a puff of smoke. Kind of embarrassing actually. Finally, and perhaps most painful of all, these matches drag on for far too long, almost needlessly so. It takes forever to get 3 count on your opponent, and you usually have to inflict a crap ton of damage before you can get the job done. I swear you could perform up to 6 finishers in a row and you'll still only get a 2 count. I guess they wanted you to go for the knockout victories just to justify the whole Backstage Assault garbage, but of course you have to enable the damn thing in the options before you could get the job done. Otherwise, good luck trying to win a match in any record time soon. Not because it's hard or anything, but mostly because after 5 or 10 minutes of this crap, boredom starts to set in. If there is any kind of improvement to be found in WCW Backstage Assault, and believe me, I'm just shocked to say such a thing, it's in the form of the Create a Wrestler function, which is much better than what we got before in Mayhem. More customizable options along with the ability to edit your creation's moveset. Not to mention you can now add in spaces to your character's name. It's not that bad of a creation system, and if you're feeling particularly bold or creative, you can either alter the appearance and movesets of the pre-existing characters, each of which have 4 costumes, and you can modify any of them, which is something that wouldn't grace the SmackDown series of games until about a generation or so later. That's actually pretty cool. A pity if the rest of the game is utter garbage. If there is anything that could be said about the graphical prowess of WCW Backstage Assault, it would be Jesus! For one thing, the wrestler models all look like crap. Not that they were all that great looking in Mayhem, but somehow the quality of these models have gotten worse, looking a bit more rugged, blocky, blurry textures and all, and prone to clipping. Almost every character has about 4 costumes, which means nothing because you could barely make out who's who here. Hell, you'd have a better chance trying to decipher wrestlers in an Atari 2600 video game than you would here. Good thing we have the name tags though. I'm not even going to bring up the quote-unquote special effects that takes place whenever a wrestler catches fire or is shocked after getting smashed in the head with a monitor. And don't get me started on the bouts of slowdown that occurs whenever I attempt an aerial attack. As for the backstage areas that the game has made into the main focus, They're pretty lackluster. For all the different areas that Backstage Assault gives you to fight in, there doesn't seem to be much effort in making any of these areas truly distinct from each other. Oh, they may have different names, different layouts, and even different textures with a couple of unique props, but take these away and you'll be hard pressed to tell the difference between a boiler room and a locker room. Just like in Mayhem, commentary on Backstage Assault is handled by Tony Schiavone and Bobby the Brain Heenan. That in itself is perfectly fine, and again, it's the highlight of Backstage Assault, as few highlights as can be levied towards the game. Anyway, the commentary here is fine. It's lively, it's enthusiastic, and it's somewhat varied. Sure, it gets tiresome after a while, but for a while it's perfectly acceptable fare. Then again, much like the previous game, commentary is a highlight when it comes to audio. The rest of it is, well, meh. You have the usual sound effects when they sound meh, whatever. They try to be cute by adding in cartoony sound effects whenever somebody goes for a ball shot or something. Yeah, doesn't work for me. Oh yeah, because of the lack of a wrestling ring, there's no ring entrances. Instead, you're given a video which introduces the wrestlers. Video's fine, not much else to say. Not that I should, anyway. Overall, WCW Backstage Assault was a misguided attempt to offer the masses a different kind of wrestling game, and the end result hammers that point abundantly clear. Mayhem might not have been the best wrestling game available, but at least it was functional and it was a wrestling game that made sense. And it was pretty decent for what it was. With Backstage Assault, I always got the feeling that instead of trying to fix some of Mayhem's flaws, EA decided to dump the wrestling ring, change a couple of things here and there, ignore the issues that needed to be addressed, and repackage the whole thing as a brand new video game. They figured that if a bunch of mealy-mouthed bastards on the internet praised the backstage brawls in Mayhem, they'd go nuts over an entire game dedicated to that aspect of gameplay. The problem with the execution is that Electronic Arts essentially broke the game by making the gameplay, well, at worst, broken beyond recognition, and at best frustrating with bouts of monotony. It's just an utter mess that will ultimately please nobody because it's absolutely wretched. I mean, hell son, if anything, Backstage Assault makes the WCW Nitro and Thunder video games on the PlayStation seem like wrestling gaming masterpieces in comparison. The acclaimed wrestling efforts of the time, as clunky and archaic as they are, have some redeeming factors to them. WCW Backstage Assault is just a putrid game all around, and if it isn't the absolute worst pro wrestling video game ever made, then there's a real stinker out there that I have yet to play. For all intents and purposes, this is a video game that deserves to be tossed over a bridge to sleep with the fishes, the same way Steve Austin tossed the IC title in 1997, but I wouldn't bother fishing this thing out. It's not very good, it's not enjoyable, it's not even larkable, it's a piece of shit, and that's all I gotta say about that. I consider this review over.